Hello, my name is Henry Infrey, and this is a Godot 2D game development tutorial. Now in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make it so that an enemy could chase a player, and the enemy will attack that player as the enemy is chasing the player. That is, while the player is moving, the enemy will chase after the player trying to punch the player. And this setup could be used in maybe a fighting game or maybe a boxing game, or you might not have your enemy trying to punch the player. Instead of punching, you could have a sword here, and the enemy could be chasing the player trying to hit him with a sword or something. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do this. Now the first thing that I did was I created the enemy. And the way I created the enemy was I took the player character and then duplicate my player's walking animation twice, and then painted his pants red. So that's the way I created my enemy. And then after painting my enemy's pants red, I took this enemy's walking frame and saved that as enemy Henry. And then I took the enemy's second walking frame and saved that as enemy Henry Wright. I've already done these things, but that's what you could do as you follow along with this tutorial. And then last thing I did was I created the punch animation. This again is just a animation that I use for the player, but I painted his pants red. So that's how I made my enemy character. And of course you want to make sure that all your frames are the exact same size. The size of each frame is 70 by 111. And that goes for the first frame, the second frame, etc. Okay, so that's how I created my enemy. Now going into Godot, the first thing I did was I created a scene. This section right here started out as a node 2D. That is, every time you open Godot and try to create a 2D scene, the first node that you see is usually a node 2D. But what I did was I took that node 2D and right click and changed it to a sprite. And then click change. Again, I already did this, but this is what you could do while following this tutorial. And then I renamed it Boxing Ring. After that, I brought in this scene, which is actually a PNG file of a boxing ring. You can find any kind of PNG file that you want on Google or throughout the internet, or you can make your own from a photograph or from a paint program or whatever you want to do. But this is what I'm using, which is here, but I loaded it in from here. And then you just click open. Next thing I did was I made sure this node was selected, click the plus, and then brought in this camera 2D. And then when dealing with camera 2D, you click the current button to on, so that when we launch our game, the scene's focus will be right in the middle where we want it to be, so that we can see our game clearly. Okay, so after I create this first scene, I went to scene, click save scene as, and then just save it. Whenever we launch our game, we want this to be the scene that we see once we add everything in and launch our game from here. So in order to get this scene once we launch our game, we go to project settings, go to run, and click this folder right here. Click on boxing ring. That's the scene that we just made. And then click open. And that's the way we get this scene once we launch our game. Okay, so that's our scene. We'll come back to this later. Next thing that I made was the enemy. Again, whenever you try to create a node in Godot, it starts off as a node 2D. But I changed it to an area 2D by right-clicking and changing it like I did with the first scene. So you just look for area 2D in this box and change it. I added a script, but we'll get to the script part later. Next thing I want to talk about is I added this animated sprite. Make sure this first tab is selected. Click this plus here and select the animated sprite. Now this first animated sprite is the walking animation for the enemy. All I did was add this tab right here and then named it walking. And then I clicked the folder right here and selected my 2 walking frames. Then just clicked open. My walking animation will go at a speed of 3. Okay, so that's my walking animation. So next thing that I did was I didn't deal with the punch animation. Right now I got it invisible, and I'm going to turn it on invisible so you can see it. to add my punch animation, click this, and then I named it punch. Then once again I clicked on the folder, and then I brought in frames that I'm going to use for the punch animation. So that's what you're seeing right here. With the second frame, you don't want to see this animation sequence until your enemy is going to use it. That is, once we launch our game, the enemy won't punch until it gets close to the player. So until then, this punch animation frame that we just created will be set to be invisible. You can make it invisible using this eye icon here, or you can uncheck this visibility box right here. I mean, once the enemy tries to punch the player, it's going to be all seamless because everything is all on the same coordinates. So make sure everything's on the same coordinate and your punch animation is not like out here or something, so that everything will work smoothly and look natural. Okay, so that's our punch animation. The next thing I did was I would have clicked on this first icon here and then brought in Area 2D node. I renamed it Player Collision to make something that the player has to collide with to trigger this enemy trying to punch the player. Then after bringing in this Area 2D node, I also clicked the plus and added the collision shape right here. And I selected the circle 2D as my collision shape. And then when that collision shape appears in the middle of this screen here, I resized it to where I wanted it. I have it to pretty much cover my enemy. These two parts work together. Without the collision shape, this thing won't work. So now we're going to go back to this first tab. Next thing I did was added a script. So I made sure this enemy tab is selected. I right clicked and attached the script. That's when you get this icon right here. I did the same thing here to this Area 2D node. Right clicked and attach a script to that too. Okay, so the first script that we're going to talk about is the enemy script. So we're just going to click this icon here and then make this bigger so you can see everything. So now I'm going to explain the script just a little bit. Now remember, this enemy is an Area 2D node, and this script extends this Area 2D node. So that's why we got this extends Area 2D node up here. We're extending this enemy node. Now, these three variables right here has to do with the direction in which the enemy will be facing. For example, if the enemy is trying to chase the player to the left direction, our enemy will be facing the left. If our enemy is chasing our player in the rightward direction, then the enemy will be facing the rightward direction. Our enemy will be chasing the player at a speed of 1. Okay, so that's what these three things mean. Next, we had to bring in our player node. We haven't talked about the player yet, but I'm bringing this player right here. I'm taking this name, which I called Henry, and I'm bringing it into here. We just simply call its name right here using this function called getParent.getNode. And then to use this in our script, throughout our entire script, we attach this stuff to a variable. That's what we use throughout the rest of our script when referring to the player character. That is, we don't call it Henry, we call it player. So that's what that part is. Now this section, you might be better off just writing this down, just copying this. And then you can try to understand it later, but just copy it. Because all this has to do with, again, just which direction our enemy will be facing while it's chasing the player. We just take these variables up here and then set it to this function right here called setDirect, so that the enemy will be facing the appropriate direction while it's chasing the player. Okay, so next we got our physics process delta function right here. For anything to move on screen, in this case our enemy to move on screen, it has to be under this function right here. Otherwise, nothing will move on screen. Remember, X has to do with going right and left. X means right and left. We're not dealing with Y, so we don't have Y anywhere in this tutorial. So, but in game program, X has to do with going left and right. In this chart right here, it plots how our enemy moves. Going left, it has to do with going in the negative direction, while going this way has to do with going in the positive direction. or going in the right direction. You can look at it as us having pluses here. But, of course, in conventional society, when dealing with mathematics, these pluses are usually invisible, just like in the same way that we were taught in school. This is the negative direction, and this is the positive direction. And this is the x-coordinate. So that's what we're looking at here when we're thinking about which direction our player is moving. So this says if the player is moving to the left in a negative direction, then our enemy's position will move in a negative direction at a speed of 1. And while it's moving in the negative direction, it faces the leftward direction. And while it's moving in the leftward direction, our walk animation plays. Likewise, L means else. So instead of writing else here, Godot uses the word L. In programming, else means otherwise. So this means else if, elif, or otherwise, if the player is in the rightward direction, then our enemy will chase the player towards the right and go towards the positive direction. Remember, positive, plus, at a speed of 1. So our enemy will move in the left or rightward direction. Otherwise, else means otherwise, it won't move. Okay, so the next part of the script involves the player collision that we made earlier. Now here, we're going to go back to this player collision here. And I put a script here too, just a brief small script on this player collision. All I did was right click, attach script, and this script is called Area 2D. All we got is just a little bit of code. We made a variable to detect whether Henry is near the enemy or not. So we go back and make sure this tab is selected. When this tab is selected, we go to Node. You click on Body Enter, click Connect, and then choose Player's Collision. Because what we're doing is we're going to put a function inside of our player collision script right here to detect whether our player has entered the player collision area, this circle right here. So choose the player collision right here, and when you hit connect inside your script, you're going to have this func on player collision body entered, which means the player has entered the circle here, and this circle is again what triggers the enemy to try to punch the player. Likewise, I click this tab again and go to body exited and click that. Click connect, and once again we choose this, which actually again refers to the script here. Click connect. We'll have this second function, which deals with whether our player is still near the enemy or not. If the player is not near the enemy, then the enemy won't try to punch them anymore until our player gets near the enemy again. Kind of cool effect, you know. Kind of like real life if you get too close to the wrong person. So that's what this part is about. That's just a brief part that we added. So now let's go back to our enemy script. And that's what this part is for. All we did was use the $ and use the name of this collision. If Henry's near the enemy, then instead of the walking animation that we have, this walking animation will disappear. This walking animation disappear briefly, and then the punch animation will appear because the enemy will be trying to punch Henry. So that's what this means. This is the punch animation. Animation sprite 2 is the punch animation, which would turn visible. And then the punch animation, this punch animation here, what we call punch, will play. And this will happen just briefly. And it will keep on playing as long as our player is in this circle area here. But if Henry is not near the enemy, this exclamation part means not, then the punch animation, this punch animation would disappear and our walking animation will reappear. And all this stuff happens very fast. So that's all this is. So in that case, we're done with our enemy. Now, let's go to the player. Player's very easy. Once again, once we try to add a new scene, usually using this plus right here, a new 2D scene, we have a node 2D. Like the other ones, I changed this to kinematic body 2D. Then I clicked on this tab, clicked the plus, and then added this animated sprite. The first animation, I called it idle, and then I clicked on the folder and brought in this one as my starting frame for while my player is not doing anything. And then I clicked this tab again and then renamed it walking. And then I brought in my walking frame. All I'm doing is combining my idle animation with my step animation. So then click open. So that's how I created my walking animation. Pretty similar sequence as making the enemy. And then for all this stuff to work, click this first tab again, click the plus, and we had to add this collision shape. In this case, I added a rectangle. So that's how I created the player. And the final thing in the idea was added a script. Right click, attach script. I named mine Henry. I click load. Now, my player is a kinematic body. And this script extends this kinematic body here. Kind of like in the same way that the enemy script extends the area 2D node. Same concept. Okay, so just write this. We needed something for this second parameter here, and that's what this is for. So just write it. Our player will move at a speed of 4. Here we created a variable for the motion vector that we're going to use down here. This part you can delete. I don't know why I got that. Once again, in this player script, you also have, just like the enemy script, we have physics process delta again. And this function, again, makes it so that your player can move. Otherwise, if all your code is up here, nothing will move. And I do have the word physics here, but in this tutorial, you can delete the word physics if you want to. We're not using any built-in physics that Godot provides. We're just creating our own code. Okay, so below this, if you press the right key, UI right means the right arrow key. X has to do with going right and left. That means if somebody presses the right arrow key, the player or Henry will go to the right at a speed of 4. We're not using the Y-axis, and our walking animation will play while that happens. Otherwise, elif means else if. Otherwise, if somebody presses the left arrow key, player Henry will move to the left in the negative direction, because remember this minus means negative, like we talked about here. So Henry will move in the left direction, and the walking animation will play when he does that too. Otherwise, again, else means otherwise. When nothing is pressed, if none of these keys are pressed, Henry won't move, and the idle animation will play. So then we set our motion variable to this function right here. And this is just finalizing our player moving. We use our motion variable as a parameter so we can actually move around on screen. And then I already talked about this up variable. Just put it, just make this and put it, because we need something for this parameter here. Otherwise, we might get errors. And then end with the pass function right here. Okay, now let's go back to the boxing ring scene that we made at the beginning of this tutorial. Now we're just going to click this icon and add in the enemy and the player. So we just click this icon here. We add our player first, because I like my name to come first. And then we click this top one again and add the enemy. Now I'm just going to zoom in, use the mouse wheel. You can't see the player because our player is behind the enemy. I want my player in front of the enemy because that's the way I am. So let's move this enemy behind, because I don't like being behind anybody. Okay, so now we can see our player and not our enemy. Okay, so our player is in front of the enemy. And this is supposed to be kind of a mini boxing game, right? So we're going to move our player over here and then move our enemy over here. The reason my enemy is faced that way is for some weird reason my enemy moves backwards if I have it facing the correct direction. That's minor, and it might not be that way for you, but that circumstance, do what works. Okay, so we got our player and enemy in the opposite direction. At the beginning of this tutorial, we've already set everything up so that once we launch our game, we'll get the scene. Okay, so now let's see what happens once we launch our game. Okay, so boxing round 1. See, so as you can see our as you can see, our little mini boxing match is working. The enemy is coming after Henry, trying to punch him. So everything's working out good. Now you can always add so that Henry could punch the enemy back, but that's kind of But I'm not trying to make this tutorial too long. And again, you can make a sword fighting game or something, and in a similar fashion. Now I'm going to add one more thing to this script. I'm going to make it so that Henry could face the direction in which he's moving. And that's very easy to make. So we're in Henry 2.gd script. Entering the player script and the enemy script. All we got to do is go to the enemy script, copy these variables, bring them to the Henry script, paste them, go back to the enemy script, and copy this function here. Again, and then we're gonna put that above this delta function here. Then go back to the enemy script again. Take this function here, and since we're talking about the left direction, we'll put it here. We do the same thing for the right direction. Put that up here. Okay, so now let's launch our game and see what happens. Okay, so now Henry can actually run in the direction in which he's facing. Hey, help! Don't hit me! I don't want to box! So, this is our mini boxing match. Okay, so you can take what you learned in the tutorial and expand on it. Again, it doesn't have to be a boxing match. This could be a sword match. Or any kind of match that you want. But these concepts still stay the same. Next time. Thanks. Bye.